Okay, here we are. I'm Mike Vinsel, and we're reading the illustrated story of Stephen Stroh. And this is just halfway through the last chapter, chapter 12. So I'm picking up in the middle of page 311. Okay, that's right. So he just bought the car. It didn't have much rust. He would have to get a book on how to repair it, or at least somehow learn a little about how to work on cars. When he got home, his parents were sitting in their chairs watching the news. Mrs. Stroh was smoking a cigarette and had a cup of coffee on the table beside her. And Mr. Stroh was reading a book about the history of the Imperial Japanese Navy. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad," Stephen said. Mr. Stroh looked up from his book. Stephen went into the kitchen. There was a pot of beef stew and boiled potatoes on the stove, still warm. "There's salad in the fridge," Mrs. Stroh said. Stephen filled his plate and went into the den to eat with his parents. "I'm going to buy a car," Stephen said. "Oh, that's wonderful. What kind?" Stephen's father asked. "It's an old Volvo. It's Dr. Law's car. He's a friend of Ted Castro. Ted Castro let him park it in the lot at the orchard and see if anybody wanted to buy it. It looks good. I took it for a test drive with a bunch of the guys," Stephen said. "That's great, Stephen," said Mrs. Stroh. "I gave my notice at the orchard today. I'm quitting. I'm going to drive the car to California," Stephen said. "Is anybody going with you?" Mr. Stroh asked. "I don't know. I just came up with the idea today." "Well, Matthew's out in San Francisco," Mrs. Stroh said. That night, Stephen planned the move. He studied the Rand McNally Highway Atlas of the United States. And then, before they all went to bed, his father came down the basement stairs. He knocked on the door. Stephen let him in. Mr. Stroh held a shoebox in his hands. Stephen knew that shoebox. It was full of maps, all folded up, so many that the top of the box bulged against the rubber band that held it closed. Stephen had always loved maps. Since he was a child, he often had gone into his parents' closet and looked at the maps in that box. There were maps of many countries, most of them from National Geographic magazine. Some were road maps from AAA, some from gas stations, some were state maps from chambers of commerce of obscure towns all across America. "I thought perhaps you might be interested in taking a look at some of these," Mr. Stroh said. "Thanks, Dad." Stephen took the box. Then he looked back up at his father, who looked back at him. His father said, "Stephen, your mother and I are both very proud of you." "Thanks," Stephen said, uncomfortably. "Dad, this is going to be great," he said. "Yes, it is going to be great," Mr. Stroh said. Stephen opened the box and spread a large map of the United States on his bedroom floor, one side topographic and the other a highway map. He knelt down to study the topographic features he might see on his big trip. Mr. Stroh knelt down to study his son. "Yes, it is going to be great, Stephen," he said. "Driving across this country is a rite of passage." "Do you know what I mean by a rite of passage?" Mr. Stroh asked. "You mean like for an African guy having to kill a lion before he can be called a man, or something like that?" Stephen said. "Well, yes. Every culture has its own version of it," said Mr. Stroh. Stephen turned the map over. Mr. Stroh watched Stephen trace prospective routes with his finger across the highway map. "You know, Stephen, all cultures have rites of passage, but not all people in a given society go through them. In fact, most people don't. But the ones who do become exceptional people. You're going to navigate your way across this country, And I'll tell you, that's no small undertaking. And it was your idea, Stephen's father told him. Stephen looked at his father. Thanks, Dad. When you're older, you'll be able to recognize a character in other people who have gone through a rite of passage. They're different from those who haven't. You'll see. Stephen nodded and returned to the map. Mr. Stroh continued, Of course, it'd be great fun if your friends wanted to go along with you. But if you go alone, the lessons will not be dissipated. After you do that, you will never be a boy again. People will see it in you. I see. I hadn't thought about it that way, Stephen said. Well, Mr. Stroh said, I'd better go catch the news. Good night, Stephen. Okay, good night, Stephen said. He looked up at he looked up as his father was leaving. Thanks, Dad. The basement room had been the bedroom for all the boys in the family at one time or another, 3 at a time. Stephen studied the maps, walking around them, looking down from all angles as if he'd been afforded a satellite view of the domain that would be his when he got the car. Then he looked around the room. There were 3 beds. One was his. Philip and Matthew had moved out. Philip was in college, and Matthew was in San Francisco. Stephen knew that in a few weeks his mother would struggle to do the housework by herself. She would walk down those basement stairs and see the empty beds. So far, all of her children who had moved out had done okay. Stephen knew he was the one who was most likely to fail. He remembered the day they'd handed out the yearbooks in high school, the spring that he'd failed to graduate, the kids reading out the senior superlatives. Most likely to succeed, most likely to marry a millionaire, most likely to drive a Porsche. Tom Devlin shouted, Most likely to live out of a shopping cart, Stephen Stroh. The whole classroom had erupted in laughter. Stephen imagined his mother standing in that basement room after he'd moved out. What must that feel like? He wondered. He knew it was going to happen, and soon. Stephen stood there in the room, thinking about the fact that these were the last few weeks of his time living with his parents. Stephen Stroh, what will you do with your life? Who will you be? He was careful to say this quietly. He had an answer. I'm the boy, the man, who carries fishing line and hooks in his wallet. He imagined a secret signature for himself in his mind. It would be a scribbled circle repeated many times, like his mother had taught him to repeat when she'd tried to improve his penmanship. This would represent coiled fishing line. In the middle of this circle would be a fishhook. He was left-handed, so the stroke of the fishhook would start with the eye in the upper right. The shaft would slope downward to the left, and the hook end would curl counterclockwise, then a quick counterstroke to make the barb. To Stephen, it seemed as iconic and eye-catching as a hammer and sickle, or a cross, or a Star of David. He would not be that poor swallow that couldn't fly. Stephen would make it in the world. Damn it, he swore. I'm that crazy guy who carries fishhooks in his wallet, who crawled through a culvert to catch a trout. That's who I am. I'll always be that guy. It took 5 more days to finish picking trash in the orchards. After that came brush burning. The brush piles at every block grew with each passing year's prunings. Some had become mountains 15 feet high and 50 yards long. They would be burned. Brush burning had to wait until snow covered the ground. Only then could they get a burning permit. This year, the first snow that stuck arrived on November 10th. The first morning of brush burning was at the Williams. They ate at the chapel diner again. Stephen had insisted that they do it. He would pay for everybody. He was leaving, and would follow the tradition Holmes had begun, that the man leaving the crew must take everybody else out for breakfast at the chapel diner. The crew ordered tall stacks of pancakes with bacon and maple syrup, fried eggs, casseroles, pumpkin pie, apple pie, custard pie, even mincemeat pie made from a moose meat from a moose that somebody had shot hunting. Over breakfast, Anton explained about the Williams. Rockmount Orchards had only recently taken it over, and it had been a family business, but land prices had risen. The owners had gotten old. Their kids had grown up and moved away, so the land had been sold to a developer. The developer had made a contract with Rockmount to manage the orchards until houses would be built, thus allowing the developer to keep as much of the land as possible in current use, the agricultural tax status. Soon the land would no longer be farmland. It would become residential land. Stephen had not known that there were different property tax rates, depending on how the land was used. So it's just a matter of time before they build houses on it then, So it's just a matter of time before they build houses on it then? Stephen asked. Yep, same as most of the blocks we do. Only the Bullard is actually owned by Rockmount, Anton said. None of the crew expressed any concern about that. Surely they must see the writing on the wall, Stephen thought to himself. They did not see this? Stephen decided he'd better not point it out. Stephen got the bill and paid it. He paid the tip too. The crew went outside and got in the van. Well, that was a satisfactory start to the day. Thanks, Steve, Greg said. Who says there ain't no such thing as a free breakfast? Jesse said, climbing into the van. At the Williams, there were a few inches of snow on the ground, but it was a strangely warm morning. Steam rose from the snow, and from certain angles refracted the sunlight into rainbow colors again. Since he'd first seen it the previous spring, Stephen had trained his eyes to look for this phenomenon. Wow, how beautiful is this? Stephen said, intending it as a statement, not a question. Dime a dozen, just like sunrises, Anton said. Stephen had first learned the word gossamer when he was younger, watching a Nova documentary on television about the Gossamer Condor pedal-powered airplane. He looked the word up in the dictionary and found that it meant something light and insubstantial, as strands of cobweb floating in the air. He didn't say it out loud. He just whispered to himself. Gossamer, rising gossamer fog, snow, steam, sunlight, rainbow, dime a dozen. It sounded like a poem to Stephen. The brush pile at the Williams was about 12 feet high and formed a ridge about 60 or 70 feet along the edge of the block, facing a stone wall. Across the stone wall was a field with corn stubble poking above the snow. Anton said that the wind was negligible, so they would start the fire at the low end of the pile, so it would burn uphill. Stephen brought the jerry can of fire starter from the van. The crew stood watching as he began to pour the mixture into the mass of sticks. He walked as he poured, making sure the oil got deep into the pile where the sticks would be dry. He poured out about half of the 5 gallons onto the pile and walked back towards the van while twisting the cap back on the container. Anton struck a road flare and lobbed it into the pile where it ignited the oil and gasoline. The fire grew quickly, and soon the interior of the pile had caught. Flames roared up, enveloping the topmost branches. The flames shot up more than twice the height of the pile before settling down again as the oil and gasoline had been consumed, and the fire began running on wood. After that, the fire moved slowly at the pace that the flames dried the wood. Tending the fire would be an all-day job after all. They backed away as heat radiated further and further outward. There was no real work to do, but just to stand around and make sure no popping embers would spread the fire. With snow on the ground, that was unlikely. There were several damaged apple bins that had not been removed from the block. Anton and Jesse rolled two of them over to the crew and turned them over to serve as seats and a table. Since they had gone out to breakfast, it was almost 11 by the time the fire was underway. Anton said if everybody chipped in some money, he'd go to the store and get a case of beer and some hot dogs. Everybody gave him a few dollars, and he left in the van. With Anton gone, the crew stood close around the upturned bins in the warmth of the fire. "So you really leaving?" Greg Edison asked. "Yep," Stephen said. "You got another job?" Greg asked. "No. Matthew's out in San Francisco. I can go there. But what I really want to see is the Golden Trout Wilderness in California. I read an article about that in Field and Stream. You know, it's Chuck Yeager who made that place a wilderness preserve. You going there?" Greg said. "Well, I think it's only accessible in the summer, so I better just get to California first," Stephen said. "Damn. Any of you guys ever been to California?" Greg asked the crew. The rest of the crew shrugged. Even Bud, who had been to California on his return from Vietnam. He'd told Stephen that, but didn't acknowledge it there by the fire. They all stood watching the fire. "At least Steve's got a plan. I'm a lifer here. What are you guys going to do?" Greg said. "Never really thought about it. I don't know what else I could do. I just hope this holds out," Jesse said. "It's not a question of what I'm gonna do. It's a question of what I'm doing. The answer to that is I'm working here at the orchard," said Bud. "It's got to be some hot babe gone out there made you willing to drive that beater out to California. If you ask me, it's a fool's errand you're going on. It's a fool's errand you're going out on. No disrespect intended," said George Malloway. "None taken," Stephen said. "I'd like to see California," Brock said. "Nope," he added. "There's no sense in trying. There's no sense in trying to talk him out of it. Ain't none of us here that isn't living out a fool's errand. Ain't nothing to be ashamed of," Brock said. And here's the picture of them, the brush burning. So they have a bin there, the case of beer, and they're just talking. Stephen didn't know why he wanted to go to California. The idea had just popped into his head, and he wanted to go there. The van came into view down the road and pulled up onto the path between the apple trees to where the crew waited. Anton got out of the van, slung open the sliding door, and lifted out the case of beer with the brown paper bag containing the hot dogs on top of it. He walked over and placed it all on one of the bins. Greg went to the edge of the block along the stone wall to a clump of thin, long, whippy maple saplings to make poles for roasting hot dogs. He cut them down with his pocket knife, many thin cuts like carving a pencil point to cut down the young trees. He returned with 7 trimmed maple poles about 10 feet long. He gave one to each member of the crew. They cut hot dogs from the string of links resting on white butcher's paper and skewered them onto the thin ends of the saplings. They wandered around the fire looking for good spots to roast the hot dogs without being roasted themselves. They ate hot dogs and drank beer for the rest of the day. By 4 o'clock, the fire had died down to smoldering embers. Anton deemed it safe for the crew to leave. The next day, they'd do another block, and after that, another, and another, until the brush piles were all burned. After that, pruning would begin again. That would complete the full cycle of working a year at the orchard. He'd done every job in its season. On Stephen's last day at Rockmount Orchards, the outdoor crew were to burn the brush. A second here. Yeah, the outdoor crew were to burn the brush pile at the Haney. The Haney, just a few acres. The Haney, just a few acres, about 7 miles from the packing house, was always the last block to be attended in any season. Stephen remembered the last day of pruning in April at this same block when Jesse had told his story of robbing the store and going to jail. That afternoon of drinking beer with the crew seemed distant now to Stephen. He remembered the feeling of wanting to be a member of the crew. He liked Greg, Brock, and Anton. He liked Bud as well, even if he seemed off in his own world. He'd grown to be wary of Jesse and George, but that wouldn't matter. Anton drove the van to the Haney. Fog covered the valley at the foot of the hillside, but the upper rows of the blocks gleamed in sunlight. Stephen poured the fire starter mixture onto the base of the pile. Anton lit it. The flames began their advance up the height of the pile and soon roared with power as they had at all the other blocks. The fire, accelerating in its fury, made almost no smoke. Shimmering clear air vibrated with heat and shot skyward through the fog cover. Stephen saw another interesting optical phenomenon. The morning sun cast its nearly horizontal rays on the surface of the fog. The heat of the fire had burned off an opening in the fog, and the sun's rays shone through the leafless forest across the road, projecting shadows of those skeletal trees on the fog opposite the fire, forming a curtain of shimmering, dancing tree shadows. Nobody else mentioned the phenomenon. 20 cents a dozen, Stephen joked to himself. At lunchtime, Ted Castro's truck pulled into the loading area. Ted and Doreen got out of the truck. Ted Castro walked over to the passenger side of the truck to assist Doreen across the snow-covered loading area. Stephen recognized that they walked together the same way they had on the day of the harvest party. Ted walked slowly and steadily while Doreen linked her arm around his elbow. "Good day, gentlemen. How goes the battle?" Ted Castro asked. "No complaints," said Anton. "Very good," Anton's father replied. "If it's all right with you, we'd like to borrow Mr. Stephen Stroh for a short while, as long as it doesn't handicap your crew too badly." "We'll survive," Anton said. "Stephen, go get your thermos. Let's take a walk," Ted Castro said. Stephen, Ted, and Doreen walked up the hill to the exact spot where in the spring, on the last day of pruning, the outdoor crew had drunk beer. There was a stone wall along the upper edge of the block, marking the property line. "Why don't we borrow a few dry stones from that wall for seats for a while?" Ted Castro suggested. They each selected a stone from the wall and brought it to the spot where they would sit and chat in the sunshine. "I'm wondering," Ted Castro said while pouring coffee from his thermos. "You're going to drive out west in that Volvo." Just a second here. You're going to drive out west in that Volvo. A young man in your position is likely to entertain 3 courses in life: find a job, go to college, or join the military. Have you thought about the military?" "Yes, I have, but I'm not sure if that's something I want to do," Stephen said. He did not want to insult Ted Castro. Ted Castro looked out over the valley, gathering his thoughts for how to explain his feelings on the subject that he most wanted to discuss with Stephen. "The world is dynamic. Do you understand the meaning of that word?" he asked. "I think so. I think it means always changing, then changing again in response to the changes. Something like that, Stephen said. That's a pretty good definition. Yes, the world is always changing, Ted Castro said. How this relates to to decisions about joining the military, I'll explain. When I was your age, the Second World War was underway. Like most men at the time, I was educated to believe that the Germans and Japanese had set out to enslave the world and had to be stopped. Stephen nodded in agreement. Ted Castro continued. That was true, and I was proud to have done what I could to help stop them. But it's different now, Ted Castro said. He looked at Stephen. Militaries conduct war, period. That is to be distinguished from defending one's country. It is my opinion that it should not be regarded as a job or as training for any civilian job. It is important to understand that the German and Japanese boys we were fighting were not defending their countries. They fought to attack other countries. At that time, the most patriotic thing those boys could have done would have been to desert or surrender. It is a crime to offer your services in the cause of aggressive war. In short, I believe a young man must pick and choose his wars carefully. The military adventures the United States is engaging in these days are not defending this country. They are simply making war, Ted Castro said. Actually, I have thought about that, Stephen said. My father once told me that the reason he retired from the Navy when he did was that he was offered command of the riverboat patrol in the Saigon River in Vietnam. He said he thought that the Vietnam War was a crime and didn't want to participate in it. I was just a kid back then and don't remember him being that way about it, but that's what he told me recently, Stephen said. Doreen changed the subject. Stephen, this is a great time in your life. You have a car, you've probably saved a little money from the harvest. You're going to drive across this country. You're going to see things and meet people you'll never forget. You're young enough that it's okay if you don't know what you want to do for the rest of your life. Most of that all depends on who you marry. I heard that it didn't work out with Tracy. No, I guess it didn't, Stephen said. Well, don't worry. You'll find the right girl for you, and when you do, you'll know it, Doreen said. Stephen didn't know how to respond. Thank you both, he said. He collected his thoughts and said, I have really enjoyed working here. I've learned so much. Welding, working with tractors, and all that stuff, Stephen said. One never knows what the future holds, but if you ever find yourself back here and in need of a job, well, as long as we're in business, you've got one, Ted Castro said. Thank you. I appreciate that, Stephen replied. And Stephen, do you remember what I told you? Just a second here. And Stephen, do you remember what I told you about wild grapes? Doreen asked. The ones that hang over Center Road? Stephen asked. All grapes, even the sour ones, are sweeter after a frost. Well, that's true for people too, Doreen said. 2 days later, in the driveway of his parents' home, Stephen started up his new old Volvo, all loaded up with his bicycle, cross-country skis, a trash bag full of clothes, his tent, sleeping bag, camp stove. He thought about the small envelope with coiled up fishing line and hooks he kept in his wallet. For food, he had a brown paper grocery bag with 3 salami sandwiches, 2 bags of Macintosh apples from Rockmount Orchards, and his thermos full of hot coffee. He said goodbye to his mother and father and said that he'd try to call occasionally along the way, and of course when he got to Matthew's place in San Francisco, so they wouldn't worry. Stephen noticed a tear fall from his father's eye. Stephen pulled out of the driveway, his parents waving goodbye. He turned left, downhill, past the house where Rob O'Leary used to live, then on to Filbert Hill Road, down to Route 101. The sun shone from a cloudless sky on the winter landscape. Stephen went over in his mind where he hoped to reach by nightfall. He had promised himself that he would not drive at night if he could help it. He wanted to see the whole country. He realized that he could see Niagara Falls the next day. That's what he would try to do. He turned on the radio. Stephen kept it tuned to WSLE in Peterborough. Stephen loved that station. He had once met the announcer, Fritz Weatherby. This morning, just as Stephen was going past Peterborough on his way west, Fritz Weatherby paused between songs to make an announcement. "I've just received a request and a dedication," he said. A young man, I've just received a request and a dedication, he said. A young woman named Tracy Bass called and told me that this morning a young man is beginning a great journey. He is driving across this country to California. Tracy asked me to dedicate this song to Stephen Stroh. Stephen, if you are listening now, this song goes out to you from Tracy Bass. Please listen to Ripple by the Grateful Dead. Stephen was listening. He drove and listened. "So you want to get going?" Fusako asked, stirring Stephen out of his daydream. "Oh, yes, I guess so. Did I doze off? I just had the weirdest dream. How long have we been here?" "I don't know, 10 minutes? Not so long," Fusako said. "I just dreamed so vivid, like a whole year. Does that ever happen to you?" Stephen said. "I suppose, sometimes. I know you're worried about me, but I'll be fine. I'm sure it's nothing. My grandparents all lived to be very old. I will too." "I love you," she said. "I love you too. Look at Mount Fuji. Isn't that something?" he said. "See over there by the river? That's the golden turd on the Asahi Brewery building. They light it up at night. That's what everybody calls it," Fusako said. They chuckled. They looked out at the sprawling nightscape of Tokyo. "When I was a kid, I used to help my mother work in the garden. Every spring we would start seedlings. It was sort of a ritual. She loved the smell of tomato seedlings. She knew she was going to die early, so she told me that every time I would smell tomato seedlings, I would think of her. I haven't grown tomatoes for a long time. I should do that." He took out his wallet, reached into the hidden slot behind his driver's license, and pulled out the folded brown paper, weather-worn but still intact. He unfolded it carefully and beheld 4 size 12 Mustad Norway dry fly fishhooks and a coil of line. "I'm still that guy," he said. "Yes, you are. Okay then," Fusako said, taking his hand. "Let's go down to the street and find some little izakaya and have some beers. It's still your birthday. Don't worry, I'll be okay. I'm sure it's nothing." The end. Okay, that's the end of that. Okay, that's The Illustrated Story of Stephen Stroh by Michael D. Vincent. That's me. Okay.